Long before cities, before borders, before the world even knew this land existed, ancient voices shaped a continent unlike any other, a place where time itself feels older, deeper, and alive. From the dream time to modern power, this is the epic story of Australia. For over 65,000 years, long before the pyramids rose, long before Rome was born, and long before the first cities appeared on Earth, Australia was already home, a vast untouched continent, older than history, older than memory, older than myth, shaped by wind, fire, and time. And on this land lived the world's oldest continuous culture, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. But to them, this wasn't simply land. It was a living being, the Dreamtime. Long before the first dawn, the first people spoke of the dreaming or dreamtime, not a dream in sleep, but the time when creator beings shaped the world. Serpent spirits carved out rivers, giant ancestral figures lifted mountains, sky beings placed stars like beads across the night, and every rock, tree, river, and creature carried a story and a law. These stories weren't just legends, they were maps, moral codes, scientific knowledge, recorded and preserved across tens of thousands of years through song, dance, and art. To walk the land was to walk through a living library, a world where every path held meaning, every sound carried wisdom, every place was sacred. The first arrivals. Archaeology reveals that humans arrived in Australia at least 65,000 years ago, navigating oceans long before Egypt or Mesopotamia existed. They adapted to one of the most mysterious continents on Earth. Scorching deserts, monsoonal rainforests, towering mountain ranges, endless coastlines, and animals found nowhere else on Earth. They mastered fire long before Europe imagined it as a tool. With controlled burns, firestick farming, they shaped forests, opened grasslands, and encouraged new growth. This ancient practice still influences modern environmental science. These were not wandering nomads. They developed complex societies, over 250 language groups, each with its own territory, traditions, and laws. Some traded ochre across thousands of kilometers. Others carved intricate tools, created stunning bark paintings, and recorded the universe through songlines, musical pathways that could guide a person across the continent without ever getting lost. The Torres Strait Islanders. To the north, between Australia and Papua New Guinea, another proud culture thrived for thousands of years. The Torres Strait Islanders, master navigators, fishermen, and ocean voyagers. Their world was built around the sea. They sailed between islands long before European explorers ventured into the Pacific, connecting communities through trade, ceremony, and kinship. Together, Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders formed one of humanity's greatest cultural tapestries, a world changing on the horizon. For tens of millennia, life unfolded in a rhythm as ancient as the land itself. Generation after generation passed down lore, discipline, stories, land care, and identity. A civilization older than Stonehenge, older than the Great Wall, older than every empire that would ever rise and fall. But across the oceans, the world was shifting. Explorers were leaving Europe. Empires were crossing seas. New maps were being drawn, and the age of global exploration crept closer to Australia's shores. The first peoples did not yet know it, but a new era was coming, one that would transform the continent forever. For tens of thousands of years, the peoples of Australia lived in harmony with a land that shaped them, and that they shaped in return. But by the early 1600s, far beyond the horizon, Europe was changing. Empires craved new trade routes, new lands, new wealth, and powerful ships sliced through oceans that once seemed impossible to cross. Soon, their sails would appear on Australia's shores. The Dutch arrive, the first Europeans. The first known Europeans to reach Australia weren't British, but the Dutch. In 1606, the Dutch navigator Willem Janszoon sighted the coastline of Cape York. His ship, the Duifken, landed on what he called New Holland. But to the Aboriginal peoples, this was already a home filled with law, stories, and spirit. Janszoon's encounters were tense. Misunderstandings led to conflict. and the Dutch soon turned away, recording the land as harsh and unforgiving. Over the next decades, more Dutch explorers mapped fragments of the western and northern coasts. Among them was Abel Tasman, who in 1642 became the first European to reach Tasmania, a place he named Van Diemen's Land. He circled the continent's edges, but never set foot on its mainland. To him this was a mysterious outline of a vast unknown, a place too dry, too distant, too dangerous, and so the Dutch left. Australia remained untouched by European settlement, but the world was still watching. The Indonesian connection, the Makassans. Not all first contact came from the west. Long before British ships arrived, Asian sailors from Makassar in modern-day Indonesia had already formed a peaceful trade relationship with northern Aboriginal communities. For centuries they sailed to Arnhem Land to harvest trepang, sea cucumber. They traded tools, beads, cloth, and stories. This was not colonization. It was cooperation, a cultural bridge across the sea. Aboriginal rock art still depicts Makassan ships, their curved sails, their wooden frames, and the encounters that shaped both cultures. It was a reminder that Australia was never isolated. It simply chose its connections carefully. But a new connection, a far more permanent one, was coming. The age of British exploration, a shift in destiny. In the mid-1700s, the British Empire began searching for new lands. The American colonies were growing restless, trade routes were tightening, and the Pacific was calling. In 1768, the HMS Endeavour set sail from England. On board was a young, disciplined navigator, James Cook. His mission, to observe a solar event in Tahiti, but secretly, he carried sealed orders. After his scientific task was complete, he was to search for the massive unknown continent rumored to exist in the south, Terra Australis Incognita, and so Cook sailed west. After months at sea, the coastline of eastern Australia rose from the horizon like a sleeping giant. On April 29, 1770, Cook's crew reached Botany Bay, making the first recorded European landing on the eastern shore. They encountered the Guyagal people. Both sides observed one another with caution, two worlds measuring the distance between them. Cook mapped the entire east coast with meticulous precision. He saw fertile land, vast resources, and a strategic jewel for the British Empire. And in a moment that would change history forever, he claimed the land for Britain. He called it New South Wales. The dawn of a new era. Cook returned to England with detailed maps, descriptions of the land, and reports that would spark a decision at the heart of the empire. Australia, once a world of ancient cultures untouched by European settlement, would soon face an unprecedented wave of change, a change brought by war, prisons, convicts, and empire, a change that would reshape the entire continent. The age of exploration was ending, and the age of colonization was about to begin. In 1770, James Cook returned to Britain with maps of a vast fertile continent. And at that very moment, the British Empire faced a crisis. Its American colonies were breaking away. Prisons in England overflowed. Crime rates soared. Cities struggled with poverty and unrest. Britain needed a solution, a place far away, a place unseen, a place it could control. Cook's discovery offered exactly that. And so in 1787, an extraordinary decision was made, one that would change Australia forever. The First Fleet, a journey into the unknown. On a cold morning in May 1787, 11 ships set sail from Portsmouth. Nearly 1,500 people were on board. Convicts, soldiers, sailors, marines, officers, and a handful of free settlers. Many convicts were guilty of petty crimes, stealing bread, clothes, coins, crimes born from hunger and survival. They had no idea where they were going, only that it was far, farther than any prisoner had ever been sent before. 8 months at sea, scurvy, disease, storms, uncertainty. Yet the ships pressed on, across oceans, toward a new world. 1788, the landing at Botany Bay. On January 18, 1788, the First Fleet finally sighted the coast of Australia. But Botany Bay, Cook's recommended site, was unsuitable. The water was shallow, the land poor, the bay too exposed. So the fleet sailed north, to a sheltered inlet filled with deep water and safe anchorage. On January 26, 1788, they landed at Sydney Cove, a date that would become one of the most significant and most debated in Australian history. Governor Arthur Phillip declared the settlement the beginning of a new British colony, New South Wales. The British believed they were establishing a new start, a fresh chapter for adventurers and exiles alike. But for the First Peoples, this day marked the beginning of a profound disruption. First contact. Two worlds collide. The Aboriginal peoples of the Sydney region had lived here for millennia. They watched from the bush as the newcomers stepped ashore. Strange clothing, strange structures, strange animals. Curiosity and caution filled the air. In the early weeks, interactions were tentative, gestures, gifts, occasional misunderstandings. But as the colony expanded, conflict grew. Hunting grounds were disrupted, sacred sites disturbed, resources strained by new demands. Diseases, smallpox, influenza, swept through communities that had no immunity, causing devastation on a scale never seen before. The world the First Peoples knew was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. Survival in the new colony. For the British settlers, life was no easier. The land was unfamiliar. Crops failed. Tools broke. Food ran dangerously low. If not for Aboriginal knowledge, plants, fishing grounds, safe water sources, the colony might not have survived its earliest years. Still, under Governor Phillip's leadership, the settlement slowly stabilized. Convicts built roads, huts, and farms. Women and children formed the first families, and a fragile society began to grow. Phillip enforced strict discipline, but also surprisingly progressive ideas. He believed convicts could be rehabilitated, that once freed they could work, own land, and start anew. It was a harsh world, but a world where transformation was possible. Expansion begins. In the decades that followed, the colony expanded beyond Sydney. New settlements emerged, roads stretched outward. Whalers, sealers, and traders arrived. Convict labor fueled growth, and with every new frontier, Aboriginal communities were pushed further from their lands. This era planted both the seeds of modern Australia and the deep wounds that still echo in the nation's heart, a continent transforming. By 1820, the small convict camp of Sydney had grown into a buzzing colony. The British were no longer visitors. They were settlers, determined, ambitious, and permanent. The ancient land of the First Peoples and the expanding world of the British colonists were now intertwined. Two stories that could never again be separated. The next chapter would see rebellion, exploration, frontier conflict, and the birth of an extraordinary new society. Australia was no longer unknown. Its future was unfolding. By the 1820s, the young colony of New South Wales had survived famine, disease, isolation, and uncertainty. But now, it was beginning to grow, to stretch, to dream. A new chapter was unfolding, one of ambition, rebellion, and the birth of new societies across the continent. The push into the interior. Sydney was no longer a remote penal outpost. It was growing, fast. As settlers demanded more land, eyes turned to the west, to mountains said to be impenetrable, a natural wall that stood between the colony and the vast interior. In 1813, Blaxland, Lawson, and Wentworth crossed the rugged Blue Mountains, opening a route into rich grazing plains beyond. This moment changed everything. Pastures expanded, sheep stations spread across the countryside. Wool became Australia's first great export. The continent, once unknown, was now being carved into farms, roads, and towns. But expansion came at a cost. As frontier conflict escalated between colonists and Aboriginal communities defending their homelands, two worlds collided, and both would be forever altered. The bushrangers, outlaws of a new land. With expansion came lawlessness. Highwaymen haunted the roads. Escaped convicts fled into the bush. Some became legends, romantic outlaws who defied authority. Names like Bold Jack Donahoe, the original wild colonial boy, became folklore. To settlers, these bushrangers were dangerous criminals. To others, they were symbols of rebellion, men resisting a system that offered them little mercy. The bush became a stage for both heroism and terror. A new spirit of rebellion, the Rum Rebellion. The early colony was controlled by powerful military officers, and none were more powerful than the New South Wales Corps. They controlled trade, they controlled land, and most importantly, they controlled rum. Rum became currency, power, influence. In 1808, tensions exploded. Governor William Bligh, yes, the same Bligh from the mutiny on the Bounty, attempted to break the military's monopoly. The officers struck back. They arrested Bligh and seized control of the colony. It was the only successful military coup in Australian history, a sign that the old order was fracturing. A new civilian society was beginning to rise. Free settlement and the end of the convict era. By the 1820s and 1830s, more and more free settlers arrived, seeking farmland, wealth, and opportunity. Convict labor still played a major role, but the colony was changing. The children of former convicts now owned shops, farms, and businesses. They were no longer prisoners. They were Australians. Calls grew louder for self-government, for rights, for a voice. The colony wanted more than survival. It wanted identity. The birth of new colonies. As the population soared, new settlements spread like sparks across the continent. 1825, Tasmania, Van Diemen's Land, became its own colony, a place of harsh prisons, deep forests, and daring escapes. 1836, South Australia, a bold experiment, a colony built on free settlers, not convicts. A society planned, shaped, and dreamed from the ground up. 1839, the Northern Territory, via South Australia, remote, vast, and almost entirely unmapped. 1835, Melbourne and Port Phillip district squatters moved into what would become Victoria. A new city emerged, fast, rough, ambitious. These colonies were no longer just British outposts. They were the early building blocks of a future nation. The first steps toward identity. By 1850, Australia was no longer a single settlement clinging to the coast. It was a continent in motion, expanding, rebelling, evolving, convicts and settlers, outlaws and officers, pastoralists and aboriginal peoples, builders, farmers, sailors, explorers. Their stories blended into something new, something unmistakably Australian. But the most dramatic transformation was yet to come, because soon the earth itself would reveal a secret that would draw the world to Australia: gold, a discovery that would ignite the greatest rush in the southern hemisphere and change the continent forever. The gold that shook an empire in 1851, whispers spread across New South Wales and Victoria. Gold, there is gold here. What began as rumors quickly erupted into a frenzy. Miners rushed to Bathurst, Ballarat, Bendigo. Within months, tens of thousands of people poured into the colonies from China, Britain, America, and Europe. Ships arrived so frequently that ports overflowed. Destitute sailors abandoned their posts. Whole towns emptied as people chased a dream of instant fortune. The Australian colonies, once slow and agricultural, were now exploding with life, ambition, and chaos. A melting pot of the world. The gold fields became one of the most diverse places on earth. English miners sang drinking songs in rough wooden pubs. Chinese miners carved intricate canals and gardens. Americans brought pistols and tall tales. Irish workers formed tight-knit gangs. Cultures collided. Languages merged. Tensions flared. Friendships formed. Australia was becoming something new. A society shaped not by class or royalty, but by the dirt beneath a miner's fingernails. The Eureka Rebellion, a flag of defiance. But with gold came greed. With fortune came unfairness, and with opportunity came oppression. In Ballarat, miners were forced to buy expensive licenses and were harassed by constant police raids. Resentment erupted. In 1854, Miners built a crude wooden stockade and raised a new flag, the Eureka flag, a symbol of unity, defiance, and freedom. They took an oath. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. The rebellion was short, bloody, and crushed by government forces, but it changed Australia forever. The miners' demands, democracy, fair representation, an end to corruption, became the foundation of modern Australian politics. The rise of Melbourne, the Golden City. Gold transformed a quiet settlement into a booming metropolis. By the 1880s, Melbourne was one of the richest cities on earth. Grand theatres, libraries, European-style boulevards, massive banks and ornate buildings. The world called it Marvellous Melbourne. Horse-drawn trams rattled through the streets. Electric lights flickered to life. Bars, hotels, and music halls roared until dawn. This was a city born from gold, brash, confident, ambitious, changing lands, changing lives. But growth carried a darker shadow. As settlers expanded inland, Aboriginal communities were displaced at devastating rates. Frontier conflict, disease, and government control policies ravaged cultures that had survived for tens of thousands of years. This era created both prosperity and deep wounds that Australia would wrestle with for generations. New colonies, new hope. The second half of the 1800s saw a political transformation. Victoria separated from New South Wales, 1851. Queensland became its own colony, 1859. Western Australia opened to settlers. South Australia expanded northward. Railways linked towns. Telegraph lines connected colonies. Industries grew. Wool, wheat, mining, shipping. Australia was no longer a string of scattered settlements. It was becoming a continent of thriving, confident societies. A new identity emerges by 1900. Something extraordinary had happened. People born in Australia no longer saw themselves as British subjects alone. They had their own accent, their own humor, their own values, equality, resilience, mateship, defiance of authority. The gold rush had reshaped the land, transformed cities, empowered ordinary people, and ignited a new national spirit, a spirit ready for what came next, federation, the birth of a unified nation, a new country stepping onto the world stage. Australia was about to be born. A storm gathers, 1914. But while Australians enjoyed prosperity and peace, the world beyond was darkening. Europe was drifting toward war. In August 1914, Britain declared conflict on Germany, and Australia, still bound by empire, followed. Young men rushed to enlist, some out of loyalty, some for adventure, some simply because their mates were going. They marched in streets, hands raised, cheers echoing behind them. None knew the horrors waiting at Gallipoli, the Western Front, the deserts of Sinai and Palestine. The nation was about to face its greatest test. Australia had been born in optimism, but it would be forged in fire. The call to war. In August 1914, when Britain declared war on Germany, Australia followed automatically. But what happened next surprised even the government. Thousands of men rushed to enlist. Some lied about their age. Some left farms, factories, classrooms. All believed they were fighting for honor, and that the war would be over by Christmas. They trained in the Egyptian desert, marching beneath the shadow of ancient pyramids. Letters home spoke of excitement, pride, and the thrill of adventure. They had no idea that history was about to carve their names into stone. Gallipoli, the birth of Anzac, April 25, 1915. Dawn. Australian and New Zealand troops landed at a cove in Turkey, a place later named Anzac Cove. Instead of a gentle beach, they faced steep cliffs, hidden machine guns, and a hail of bullets that cut through the waves. The landing was chaos, but they kept fighting. Day after day, month after month, in heat, in flies, in mud, in terror. By the end, the campaign was a failure, but something deeper emerged. The Anzac spirit, courage, mateship, humor in suffering. The refusal to give up. It became the foundation of Australia's modern identity. Every year on April 25th, the nation remembers. The crash by 1930, the Great Depression had reached Australia with a force no one was prepared for. Global markets collapsed. Banks tightened credit. And trade, the lifeblood of Australia's economy, came to a standstill. The country that had celebrated prosperity in the 1920s was suddenly on its knees. Unemployment and struggle. Unemployment rose to 32%, one of the highest rates in the Western world. Factory doors shut. Mining towns were abandoned. Farmers watched their crops wilt and their debts triple. Families who once lived comfortably queued in soup lines. Children carried tin cups to collect stew from charity kitchens. Men walked miles each day searching for work that didn't exist. And across the nation, a new term echoed: SUSO, government sustenance payments, barely enough to survive. The widow of Wentworth Street. The camera shifts to a narrow street in Sydney. Here, a woman named Mary O'Donnell sits on her doorstep with her children. Her husband, a war veteran, cannot find work. Every night, she tears bread into smaller pieces so each child gets some. She whispers, "Just a little longer. Things will get better." Stories like hers were everywhere. Riots and political turmoil. Anger grew. In 1932, when New South Wales Premier Jack Lang refused to pay interest to British banks, the federal government dismissed him. A political earthquake. Crowds clashed in the streets. Police battled protesters. The nation was divided between those who wanted austerity and those who demanded radical change. It felt as if Australia's young democracy was being pulled apart. A symbol of hope, the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Amid the darkness, one project stood as a beacon of hope. In 1932, the Sydney Harbour Bridge opened. Workers who had survived the Depression stood on the arches with pride. Tens of thousands gathered to celebrate the achievement. For a moment, the nation remembered what it could accomplish when united. The 1930s, modern life emerges. Despite hardship, the decade changed Australia. Radios became common, bringing news and music into homes. Hollywood films arrived, creating new dreams. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers. Aboriginal rights activists began organizing for justice. Migrants contributed new skills and cultures. The Depression shook the country, but also reshaped its identity, making Australians tougher, more resourceful, and more aware of one another. The shadow over Europe. As the 1930s drew to a close, attention shifted from economic recovery to something more ominous. Adolf Hitler rose in Germany. Militarism surged in Japan. Parades of soldiers marched across Europe and Asia. Warships patrolled the Pacific. Australia watched from afar, nervous, uncertain, and fearful. Many hoped the horrors of World War I would never return, but by 1939 the world was sliding once again toward catastrophe. When Britain declared war on Germany, Australia stood beside it. The young nation was about to enter the most dangerous decade in its history. The crash by 1930, the Great Depression had reached Australia with a force no one was prepared for. Global markets collapsed. Banks tightened credit. And trade, the lifeblood of Australia's economy, came to a standstill. The country that had celebrated prosperity in the 1920s was suddenly on its knees. Unemployment and struggle. Unemployment rose to 32%, one of the highest rates in the Western world. Factory doors shut. Mining towns were abandoned. Farmers watched their crops wilt and their debts triple. Families who once lived comfortably queued in soup lines. Children carried tin cups to collect stew from charity kitchens. Men walked miles each day searching for work that didn't exist. And across the nation, a new term echoed: SUSO, government sustenance payments, barely enough to survive. The widow of Wentworth Street. The camera shifts to a narrow street in Sydney. Here, a woman named Mary O'Donnell sits on her doorstep with her children. Her husband, a war veteran, cannot find work. Every night, she tears bread into smaller pieces so each child gets some. She whispers, "Just a little longer. Things will get better." Stories like hers were everywhere. riots and political turmoil. Anger grew. In 1932, when New South Wales Premier Jack Lang refused to pay interest to British banks, the federal government dismissed him. A political earthquake. Crowds clashed in the streets. Police battled protesters. The nation was divided between those who wanted austerity and those who demanded radical change. It felt as if Australia's young democracy was being pulled apart. A symbol of hope, the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Amid the darkness, one project stood as a beacon of hope. In 1932, the Sydney Harbour Bridge opened. Workers who had survived the Depression stood on the arches with pride. Tens of thousands gathered to celebrate the achievement. For a moment, the nation remembered what it could accomplish when united. The 1930s, modern life emerges. Despite hardship, the decade changed Australia. Radios became common, bringing news and music into homes. Hollywood films arrived, creating new dreams. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers. Aboriginal rights activists began organizing for justice. Migrants contributed new skills and cultures. The Depression shook the country, but also reshaped its identity, making Australians tougher, more resourceful, and more aware of one another. The shadow over Europe. As the 1930s drew to a close, attention shifted from economic recovery to something more ominous. Adolf Hitler rose in Germany. Militarism surged in Japan. Parades of soldiers marched across Europe and Asia. Warships patrolled the Pacific. Australia watched from afar, nervous, uncertain, and fearful. Many hoped the horrors of World War I would never return, but by 1939 the world was sliding once again toward catastrophe. When Britain declared war on Germany, Australia stood beside it. The young nation was about to enter the most dangerous decade in its history. 1939, a familiar call. Just like in 1914, Australia entered World War II as part of the British Commonwealth. Young men enlisted again. Families watched them board trains, waving hats from the platform, unsure if they would ever return. Australian soldiers were sent first to the Middle East, to deserts scorched by sun and war. They fought in Libya, Syria, and North Africa, earning a reputation for courage and grit. But far away in the Pacific, a storm was building that would change everything. Pearl Harbor and the threat to Australia, December 7, 1941. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Within weeks, Japanese forces swept across Asia, conquering territories at terrifying speed. Then came the unthinkable. Bombers attacked Darwin. Explosions shook the earth. Ships burned in the harbor. The sky rained metal. It was the largest foreign attack on Australian soil. For the first time in history, Australia realized, we are no longer fighting for Britain. We are fighting for our own survival. The fall of Singapore, a shattered belief. For generations, Australia believed that Britain's navy would always protect them. But in 1942, Singapore, Britain's major base in Asia, collapsed. It was a devastating moment. Tens of thousands were taken prisoner. Australia felt abandoned. Prime Minister John Curtin made a bold decision. He turned to the United States for help. A new alliance was born, one that would shape Australia's future. The Kokoda Track, Australia's defining moment. The scene shifts to dense jungle, misty mountains, the sound of rain dripping through leaves. In Papua New Guinea, Australian troops, many barely trained, faced elite Japanese forces along the brutal Kokoda Track. The terrain was hell, steep cliffs, mud that swallowed boots, rain that never stopped, leeches, disease, exhaustion. But they held the line. They pushed back against the Japanese advance, step by agonizing step, in what became one of Australia's greatest military achievements. The Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, local Papuan villagers, carried wounded soldiers to safety, saving countless lives. Kokoda became the symbol of determination and the moment Australia truly stood on its own. To the home front. Everyone must do their part. While soldiers fought overseas, Australia at home transformed completely. Women became mechanics, welders, factory workers. Children collected scrap metal, Civilians trained in air raid drills. Cities enforced blackouts. The government rationed food and clothing. It wasn't just a war fought by soldiers. It was a war fought by the entire nation. The end of war, 1945. By 1945, Japan surrendered. Europe was in ruins, and millions across the world mourned the dead. Australia lost nearly 40,000 lives in battle, prisons, and bombings. But something else had changed. Australia emerged with a new confidence, a new identity, and a new sense of independence from Britain. The world it entered after the war was not the world it left behind. The post-war transformation, 1945 to 1950. The war ended, but Australia's next challenge had already begun. Building the future. The government launched the mass migration program, inviting people from war-torn Europe to settle in Australia. Ships arrived daily. Italians, Greeks, Dutch, Poles, Germans, Yugoslavs. They brought new food, new ideas, new energy. Australia was becoming multicultural, and it would never be the same again. Cities expanded. Industry boomed. The population surged. Hope filled the air. The war had scarred the nation, but it also opened the door to a new era of growth and possibility. Entering the new millennium, 2000-2005, the early 2000s marked a period of optimism for Australia. The nation stepped confidently into the global spotlight with the success of the Sydney 2000 Olympics, which presented Australia as modern, multicultural and unified. With a strong economy powered by mining, agriculture and expanding trade ties, especially with Asia, Australia grew rapidly. At home, society became more diverse as immigration continued to shape the cultural landscape. Yet new challenges emerged. The global rise of terrorism prompted tighter security measures, particularly after the 2002 Bali bombings, which deeply affected Australians and reshaped foreign policy and counter-terrorism efforts. Despite these shocks, the country maintained stability, laying the foundation for long-term development. The economic boom and social change, 2005-2010, Australia entered one of the strongest economic phases in its history. Largely driven by the mining boom and intense demand for natural resources from China, cities expanded, wages grew, and Australia experienced one of the longest periods of uninterrupted economic growth worldwide. At the same time, debates on climate change intensified as droughts worsened and extreme temperatures increased. Public demand for environmental responsibility grew stronger. This era also saw an increased focus on Indigenous rights and a national push for reconciliation, culminating in the historic 2008 national apology to the stolen generations, an emotional moment that reflected Australia's ongoing efforts to acknowledge its past and build a more inclusive future. Stability, multicultural growth, and new challenges, 2010-2015. During these years, Australia continued to diversify culturally as immigration reached modern highs, creating a society rich in languages, traditions, and global influences. Technological change transformed work, communication, and entertainment, pushing the country deeper into the digital age. Politically, leadership changed frequently, reflecting shifting alliances and national debates on policy, climate, and economic direction. Natural disasters, floods, cyclones, and bushfires intensified, highlighting the urgency of climate challenges. Yet through every crisis, Australia displayed resilience, with communities uniting to rebuild and support one another. Globally, the nation strengthened its position as a stable, democratic, and economically strong country. Environmental crisis and global response, 2015-2020. The late 2010s were marked by some of the most devastating environmental events in the nation's history. Years of drought culminated in the Black Summer bushfires of 2019-2020, which burned millions of hectares, destroyed wildlife populations, and shocked the world. These fires became a defining moment that pushed climate issues into national focus. Economically and socially, Australia remained strong, but environmental pressure exposed vulnerabilities. Just as recovery began, the COVID-19 pandemic emerged. Australia responded with some of the strictest border closures and public health systems in the world, resulting in lower case numbers compared to many countries. These years reshaped how Australians viewed security, travel, environment, and community responsibility. A nation rebuilding and redefining its future, 2020-2025. In the early 2020s, Australia focused on rebuilding its economy, reopening its borders, and reconnecting with the world. The pandemic accelerated digital transformation, remote work, and advances in medicine and technology. At the same time, national dialogue about Indigenous recognition intensified, including debates over constitutional change and the future of the voice to Parliament. Climate initiatives pushed toward renewable energy, cleaner technologies, and environmental protection. By 2025, Australia emerged as a nation blending ancient cultural heritage with modern innovation, a resilient, multicultural, environmentally conscious country stepping into a future shaped by both tradition and progress.